Maybe I would throw in a statistic here because some people might like statistics, but in 2016, it was estimated that there were 564,000 Canadians living with dementia, plus about 25,000 new cases diagnosed every year. So by the year 2031, the number is expected to rise to close to 1 million, which is an increase of about 66%. So us baby boomers have arrived. And the thing that scares me an awful lot is that we don't have resources in place for all of us baby boomers. And that scares me a lot. There is a dementia strategy now, which I'm very happy about. So hopefully we'll be addressing some of those issues. All right, people want to know what causes Alzheimer's disease. So the first thing that you need to know is that age is the #1 reason for developing Alzheimer's disease. So if you're planning on getting any older than you are right now, you might want to plan for having dementia as well. Sorry. That's one of Dr. Corey's jokes. So about 5 to 10% of people diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease are under the age of 65. We have a client in our program that started at the age of 39. He was 39 when he started in our program. You can actually read about him in Maclean's magazine. That came out a couple of years ago. And his name's Joel. And yeah, I have a picture of him coming up. If you get closer to the age of 80, over the age of 80, fully about 30% of us will have Alzheimer's disease. Yeah, so a third of us. So out of every 3 of you here, 1 of you may develop Alzheimer's disease. Isn't that a wonderful?
Oh, no.
Yeah, everybody's looking, not me. Okay. About a third of you will become frail. You'll still be cognitively intact, but you'll be frail. And about a third of you will be what we call healthy people. You will be cognitively intact and you still physically will be able to do things. So that's over the age of 80. One of those horrible statistics. Speaking of Joel, did it again. This young man right here, that's Joe. Joel, as I call him. I say, bonjour, monsieur, every time I see him because his mother tongue was French, so we have a little conversation in French. People with Alzheimer's disease, if English was their second language, they will return back to their mother tongue. So if it's somebody that speaks German or Polish or Chinese or something, you have to learn some of that. At least the social lubricants. Okay. People like Joe, there's usually a genetic component, and we know that definitely in Joe's case there is a genetic component. So there is a family history, very strong family history. His mom was in a nursing home by the age of 42. It's all genetics. So I'm going to try and explain this, and I hate trying to explain genes. So we each get genes from our parents, right? So your mom gives you one set, and your dad gives you one set. The genes that are involved in Alzheimer's disease are what we call ApoE4 genes. So people will have either ApoE2s, ApoE3s, ApoE4s. They can have a combination of 2s and 3, 2 and 3, 2 and 4, 3 and 4, etc. 2 2s, 2 3s, 2 4s. People that get 2 4s, let's start with 1 ApoE4. If they get 1, your increase of developing Alzheimer's disease is increased. If you get 2, you will get Alzheimer's disease. There's no question about that. So having ApoE2s, 2 copies of it, it seems to be protective against Alzheimer's disease. So that's what we know. So a lot of genetics going on, looking at the different genes that are involved in Alzheimer's disease. Carrying on with the causes, there is a cardiovascular risk, okay? So if you don't take care of yourself and you don't, if you don't eat for a healthy lifestyle, healthy heart, then you probably are putting yourself at risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So we talk about taking care of yourself. So if you're a smoker, quit. If you're overweight, try and lose weight. If you're a diabetic, keep your sugars under control, okay? All of those things, and eat a healthy diet, which some people have heard of the Mediterranean diet, which means that you have very little red meat. You won't eat a lot of pork. You'll eat chicken, but the majority of things that you eat will be fish, like salmon. I hate salmon. I am so doomed. You also need to keep your blood pressure under control. So when they bug me at work, I tell them, you know what, you're putting me at cardiovascular risk, please stop. Education. People with less education will be more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease than people with a higher level of education. Okay? And we don't know exactly how it works, but we think it's because people with a higher level of education create more connections in their brain. So they have more in reserve. So they're able to compensate for much longer. People with lower levels of education, they don't have that ability. So you'll probably see people with lower education showing up at younger ages. Now, for every rule, there are exceptions. So you will still have, we've had a multitude of doctors that come through. We have had a multitude of lawyers, nurses, social workers, so it's not always a protective factor, but it is one of those things that they look at. One of the most interesting lectures that I went to was probably about 10 years ago, where somebody was speculating on, when does Alzheimer's disease start? And he was thinking that, it's a possibility that Alzheimer's might actually start when people are in high school. That's why they don't go higher education. That's kind of a scary thought, that it started way back then. But there seems to be more and more research into that. If you want to read a really good book, it's called The Nun's Story. And it's all about the research that Dr. Snowden, I think his name was, did with a bunch of nuns. So nuns are actually pretty good because they all live in a convent. They all eat the same food. They're exposed to the same environment, etc. And one of the really interesting things that, excuse me, that Dr. Snowden noticed is that when the nuns first entered the convent, they had to write like a little biography about themselves, right, and describe their life up until that point. And what he noticed is that the nuns that developed Alzheimer's disease, and they knew this afterwards, because they did autopsies. The nuns actually left their brains to research, all the nuns in this particular convent. So when they started actually doing some autopsies on these brains, they could connect the essay with the nun. And what they noticed was that the nuns that had a really bland biography, there wasn't a lot of, I grew up in London, Ontario, had 3 brothers, mom and dad, went to high school. They were the most likely to develop Alzheimer's, and they had the most severe symptoms. The girls that wrote essays that were very, there was a lot of meat to them. It's like, I grew up in the beautiful city of London, Ontario, also known as the Forest City because of the massive numbers of trees that just are so beautiful in the fall. They would talk about that. I had a wonderful life. I had 3 great brothers, and we would do this and that. So the more that they put into their essay and the more colorful it was, when they looked at their brains later on and matched them up, they had either no Alzheimer's disease, or their symptomology was less severe, or they developed it later on. It's very interesting.
You had 3 great brothers.
Do I have 3 great brothers? I have 3 amazing brothers. I really do. Some days I hate them. Okay. All right.
Yes.
One of the other things that we're looking at is people becoming socially isolated, especially in later life. A lot of people in your lives leave through death, so you become more and more alone. So what we're seeing is people that become very self-isolated actually tend to develop Alzheimer's disease. Okay. This is one of Dr. Borey's favorite slides. He talks about plaques and tangles in this. So over here we have a healthy couple of neurons. They're able. Oh, come on. They are able to communicate. They're very healthy looking. Over here, we talk about plaques and tangles. So the plaques are amyloid protein, and this amyloid protein is actually a sticky substance, and it interferes in the neurons passing messages back and forth to each other in nutrition and nutrients and stuff. On the inside of the cell, at the nucleus, there's a tau protein, and it tends to end up getting all tangled. And somebody explained that it kind of looks like spaghetti all thrown together. Okay? That's what some of the research is about. How do we, if we remove the plaques, does that help with memory? How exactly is that tau protein involved? And what we know is that amyloid and tau are involved in all of the dementias. Kind of interesting. So tau proteins, the tallus and then the non-tallus and stuff. Okay. Any questions about that? No? Okay. This next picture, basically a picture of a brain. So this is a healthy brain. You can see that there isn't a lot of spaces in between here. That's called the gyra. I've learned that in the last 18 years. And if you look over here, This is a brain that has Alzheimer's disease. And you can see all the spaces of the gyra. So brains actually become smaller. It's what the doctors and stuff call atrophy in the brain. And it's the result of brain cells dying. And so when people die, they do an autopsy on the brain, or people should do an autopsy on the person's brain, especially if there are next generations coming up, like you have children, grandchildren, you want to know a good medical history. But the only way that you can determine whether or not somebody has Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body, is to actually have the brain autopsy. So if somebody dies in long-term care, you want to ask that they have their brain autopsied when they die. So you kind of have to forewarn people, like the nurses and the doctor at the long-term care home, that you want to find out exactly what was going on. Kind of morbid, but it is an important thing to do. Like I said, if you have kids coming up, you want to have a good medical history for people. I think we talked about vascular dementia and the mixed dementia. Are there any questions about vascular dementia, mixed dementia? No? How about dementia with Lewy body or Parkinson's? So go ahead.
Any evidence about how those proteins are coming to pass in the brain? That is, how they're forming in the brain? Is it connected? I mean, I've heard it's not connected to diet. What is it connected to? Do we know?
Okay. If we knew that,
Right.
we would be able to figure out what
Right.
causes it,
Right.
and we don't.
Right. Okay.
So the research is pointing to misfolding of the material in the brain. Yeah.
But it's not, at this point, cut down on your protein because excess protein is
No, it's a different kind of
killing
protein.
your brain.
No, all
Yeah.
these proteins exist in your brain naturally. It's just these proteins have, in some way, shape, or form, mutated to plaques and tangles, unfortunately. So it's not a matter of cutting down on your proteins or becoming a vegetarian or anything like that. No.
Thank you.
Strictly speaking, what you're talking about Alzheimer's, but dementia may be more related to diet, such as sugar, excess sugar.
We do talk about diet, things like being a diabetic, you have to keep your sugars under control. We talk about not eating red meat more than once a week, like really cutting down on red meat, having more fish. We've gotten away from having fish in our diets and fish oil. I remember cod liver oil, and basically we got away from that. But, is that one of the things that, was protective at some point in time? I don't know. But certainly diet, exercise, those sorts of things will help in, possibly not developing Alzheimer's disease, but there's no guarantees. Okay.
Helen, I think another thing that I found out, you may have told us, or I found out in those meetings, that there are a number of people here that are musicians, good musicians, and working away with like music, and that's a very positive thing as well. You mentioned diet and exercise, but even playing music and memorize, that sort of thing is stimulating the brain.
Yeah, anything that you can do to stimulate the brain is really important. So doing all sorts of things. It's not just playing music, but listening to music. Music is one of those interesting things that lights up your whole brain. There isn't one part of your brain that is your music center. When you listen to music, it lights up your whole brain. They can see this on functional MRIs and stuff, that, it just lights up, brilliant colors and stuff. So music is really important, but doing things like crossword puzzle, word searches, Sudokus, anything to stimulate your brain, learning something new is really important, like finding a new hobby or something. Exercise is really, really important. Dr. Susan Hunter does a lot of research with us, and she developed an exercise program that we do every single day with all of our clients. And it's designed to enhance, you know, if you do enough exercising, you actually generate new brain cells. I tell that to my early stage group, and they go, okay, so how much exercise would we have to do? They're pretty funny. I love my early stage group. But yeah, you wouldn't be able to regenerate an entire brain with exercise, but it does help. And the research does show that you can develop some new brain cells by exercising. And how much exercise